Cop pulls gun on black woman, Scorns FBI badge. 2 minutes later, he's cuffed. 65 miles per hour. That's all it took. A routine stop, they said. But why did the officer's hand hover so close to his gun? Why did his eyes linger, searching for something or someone? FBI Director Ivy Lawson knew this wasn't protocol. It was a power play, a game of cat and mouse, and tonight, she was the prey. But who was pulling the strings, and what were they hiding? The answer, she knew, would ignite a firestorm of fury. The road stretched ahead, empty under the faint glow of the streetlights, a quiet contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Ivy Lawson, the newly appointed FBI director, had spent years navigating the corridors of power, dismantling criminal enterprises and upholding the very laws that bound the nation together. Yet tonight, none of that seemed to matter. The flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror painted an all-too-familiar story, one she had read about in countless case files, one she had fought against, and one she now found herself living. Her grip tightened around the steering wheel as she glanced at the speedometer, exactly 65 miles per hour. No infractions, no reckless driving, no broken taillight. There was no reason for this stop. And yet, the cruiser behind her did not budge. A slow exhale left her lips as she signaled and pulled over, guiding her car onto the shoulder with practiced ease. She had worked alongside law enforcement her entire career, and she knew the procedures. But as she watched the long pause between the cruiser stopping and the officer stepping out, she felt something cold settle in her chest. Something was off. It was in his posture. The stiff, overly aggressive stance, the way his left hand hovered too close to his firearm, while the right gripped the flashlight as if he was expecting trouble. Ivy had encountered many officers before, good and bad, and she recognized this kind. Officer Ethan Rourke moved with a false sense of authority, not one derived from duty, but from unchecked power. When she lowered her window, keeping her hands visible on the wheel, she was met not with protocol, but with hostility. "License and registration," he barked, skipping any semblance of pleasantries. His eyes flicked over her face, the beam of his flashlight lingering too long, too deliberately, as if searching for something. Ivy suppressed the urge to sigh. This was a game to him. She had seen it before, an officer looking for any excuse to escalate, to turn a routine stop into a power struggle. Remaining calm, Ivy spoke evenly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" It was a simple question, one she had every right to ask. But instead of an answer, Rourke chewed his gum and repeated himself, his voice colder this time. "License and registration." Ivy's gut twisted in warning. He was testing her, waiting for her to push back so he could justify whatever came next. Instead, she reached into her purse, deliberately slow, retrieving both her driver's license and her FBI identification, setting them on the window's edge for him to take. And that's when she saw it, the brief flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. Contempt. And then, something worse. Disregard. He didn't take the credentials. He didn't acknowledge the badge that should have ended this stop in an instant. Instead, he stepped back. "Step out of the vehicle." Ivy blinked, her instincts screaming now. "Excuse me?" she asked, though she already knew what was happening. She had done nothing wrong, had presented her credentials, and yet, here he was, pushing forward anyway. She saw the tension in his fingers, the barely concealed thrill in his eyes. She had seen this before. The footage of officers escalating situations without cause, pressing until fear dictated compliance, twisting the narrative in their favor. But fear had no place in Ivy Lawson. She had spent her career dismantling men like this. Her voice dropped into a steely calm. "Officer Rourke, I strongly suggest you rethink that order. You're well outside of protocol." For the first time, hesitation flashed across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "I said step out." It was a warning and a challenge wrapped into one. Ivy didn't move. On what grounds? The flashlight beam flickered slightly as he struggled for an answer. He didn't have one. But instead of backing down, his jaw flexed, his hand moved closer to his weapon, and in that moment, Ivy knew he was looking for an excuse. And if she wasn't careful, he would find one. Ivy Lawson had faced danger before, As FBI director, she had stood face to face with cartel leaders, dismantled organized crime rings, and led high-stakes operations against domestic threats. But this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a quiet highway in her own country, and the person threatening her wasn't a criminal. He was supposed to be the law. Officer Ethan Rourke's stance was calculated, his right hand now hovering over his holstered firearm, fingers itching to seize control of the situation. Ivy knew exactly what he was doing. She had read the reports, seen the body cam footage from too many cases just like this. A minor escalation. A non-compliant suspect. A perceived threat. A gun drawn. A life taken. She refused to be that story. Slowly, deliberately, she exhaled. Officer Rourke, let me be very clear. I am the director of the FBI. I have provided identification. You have no probable cause to detain me. If you continue down this path, you will regret it. Her voice was steady, but her body remained still. She knew that any sudden movement, a twitch, a shift, a defensive reflex, could be twisted into resisting arrest. Rourke didn't budge. He wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in power. Then the second car arrived. The additional red and blue lights painted streaks across the pavement as a second officer stepped out, taller than Rourke, broader, his expression unreadable. The glint of his badge reflected in the glow of the headlights, but his nameplate was conveniently hidden. Ivy's stomach tightened. This wasn't backup, this was reinforcement. Problem here? The second officer asked, his voice flat, almost bored. He barely looked at Ivy, his attention locked on Rourke, who smirked as if they had done this dance before. Non-compliant driver, Rourke replied, tapping his fingers against his holster. Ivy caught the word choice immediately. Not FBI director, not even ma'am, just driver. He was stripping her identity away one piece at a time, reducing her to a category, a statistic, a suspect. The second officer stepped closer, his posture relaxed but calculated. He was positioning himself behind her blind spot, blocking any chance of retreat. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. This was a power play. Ma'am, step out of the vehicle. Ivy didn't move. You haven't told me why I'm being detained. Rourke scoffed, shaking his head like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Refusing to comply is enough reason. The words rang in her ears, loud and final. There it was, the trap. He had backed her into a corner where both choices led to escalation. If she complied, she was at their mercy. If she resisted, they had their excuse. She breathed. Years of experience told her that rage would get her nowhere. Fear was useless. The only way out of this was strategy. So with meticulous precision, Ivy reached for the door handle, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't complying, she was controlling the narrative. The cold night air hit her skin as she stepped out, the officers now towering over her. She made sure her hands remained visible, her stance strong. Turn around, Rourke ordered. Ivy squared her shoulders. Not until you tell me why I'm being detained. The muscles in Rourke's jaw tightened, his patience fraying. The second officer shifted, fingers twitching. They wanted her to submit. They wanted her to break. But Ivy Lawson had never broken. And she wasn't about to start now. Ivy Lawson had been in dangerous situations before. She had faced armed criminals, negotiated with terrorists, and dismantled entire crime syndicates. But nothing compared to the silent, insidious danger of men who wore the law like a shield and used it like a weapon. She stood firm, her back straight, her hands visible, while Officer Ethan Rourke stared her down. His partner, the nameless second officer, stood just behind him, muscles taut, waiting for a reason, any reason, to escalate. Ivy knew exactly what this was, a power play, a test, a moment they expected her to fail. She wouldn't. Turn around, Rourke repeated, impatience tightening his tone. Ivy met his gaze unwavering. On what grounds, officer? For the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. He didn't expect her to push back. He expected fear, submission, compliance. Instead, he got cold, unwavering resistance. The second officer exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. We're giving you an order, ma'am. Obstructing an officer is a chargeable offense. There it was, the trap, the setup they'd used on so many others. A woman refused to comply, obstruction. A man questioned their authority, resisting arrest. A citizen demanded their rights, disorderly conduct. Ivy knew the playbook. She had read the reports, the affidavits, the court cases that never made it past a judge because the defendant died resisting. She would not be next. "You're both making a mistake," she said coolly. "If you don't de-escalate this situation right now, I will ensure that neither of you wears that badge tomorrow." Rourke let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Lady, you're in the middle of nowhere. No cameras, no witnesses. You think pulling rank is gonna scare me?" Ivy smirked. He had just made his biggest mistake. There was a witness. The man on the side of the road, the one who had been watching from the shadows, now stood with his phone raised. Recording. The second officer noticed first, his head snapping toward the man. "Hey, put the phone down." The man didn't move. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Ivy said, voice even. "You're being recorded. You so much as touch him, and this video goes viral before you can file a falsified report." The tension cracked. Rourke's hand twitched near his holster. He was weighing his options, deciding whether to back down or double down. Ivy could see the panic creeping into his expression. The world was watching now. The second officer took a slow step back, his pulse visible at his throat. He glanced toward the approaching sirens in the distance. Backup was coming, but not for them. Ivy smiled. Checkmate. Ivy Lawson watched as the flashing red and blue lights grew closer, the approaching squad cars slicing through the heavy tension. For the first time since this nightmare began, Officer Ethan Rourke looked uncertain. His arrogance had been unwavering until now. Ivy had seen men like him before. Men who had spent their entire careers wielding authority like a weapon, mistaking fear for respect. Men who never questioned whether they would face consequences because they never had to. Tonight, that was about to change. The second officer took a cautious step back, his fingers twitching near his belt. He was still considering damage control, still weighing whether they could spin this in their favor. But they weren't in control anymore. The moment the squad car skidded to a stop, uniformed officers poured out. One of them, a lieutenant by the insignia on his uniform, moved quickly toward them. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in Ivy's stance, calm but firm, hands visible, before locking onto Rourke and his partner. Then recognition dawned. "Director Lawson?" His voice cut through the night air like a gunshot. Ivy exhaled slowly. The lieutenant's head snapped toward Rourke. "What the hell is going on here?" Rourke hesitated for half a second too long. His face tightened. He had already lost, but he still hadn't realized it yet. Ivy cut him off. "Officer Rourke detained me under false pretenses, refused to state probable cause, and escalated to the use of force without justification." The lieutenant's jaw flexed. He turned to Rourke, his tone razor sharp. "Is that true?" Rourke didn't answer. The second officer's silence was even louder. The lieutenant didn't wait for excuses. He gestured to the approaching officers. "Cuff them both." A rush of movement, metal clicking. Ivy didn't flinch when the cuffs snapped around Rourke's wrists. His face twisted with disbelief. You can't be serious," he sputtered. "I was just doing my job." Ivy met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No, Officer Rourke, you were abusing it." For the first time that night, he understood what it meant to be powerless. Ivy Lawson stood in the center of the precinct's sterile, fluorescent-lit holding room, watching as Officer Ethan Rourke sat across from her, hands cuffed to the table. His bravado had faded, replaced with something colder, anger perhaps. Or maybe disbelief. She had seen it before. Men who had never faced consequences struggling to process the weight of them. The internal affairs investigator, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression, slid a thick folder onto the table. "Officer Rourke, you're under investigation for misconduct, abuse of power, and excessive use of force. Do you have anything to say for yourself before we proceed?" Rourke scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I stopped a suspicious vehicle." She refused to comply. Ivy tilted her head. "Suspicious how?" Rourke hesitated. She leaned forward, voice measured but firm. Because I was driving late at night? Or because I didn't look like someone you thought should be behind the wheel of a car like mine? The second officer, the one who had backed Rourke up, sat 2 chairs down, shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't cuffed, but he wasn't off the hook either. The investigator opened the folder. Your body cam footage tells a different story. Ivy's stomach tightened. She had seen too many of these cases where the truth was distorted, where officers claimed malfunctioning footage or missing evidence, but not this time. The investigator pressed a button, and the audio played first. Rourke's voice, sharp and unrelenting. Step out of the car. Ivy's voice measured. On what grounds, officer? A pause, a flicker of static. Then Rourke's next words, cold and laced with something dangerous. I don't have to explain myself to you. Silence settled over the room. Ivy watched as the investigator locked eyes with Rourke. That alone is enough to terminate you. Rourke's fists clenched. This is a setup. Ivy exhaled. No, Officer Rourke, this is accountability. For the first time, the second officer spoke. His voice was quiet, almost regretful. I told you to let it go, man. Ivy's gaze sharpened, so he knew. The investigator sighed, closing the folder. Officer Rourke, as of this moment, you're suspended without pay pending further investigation. Given the evidence, I'd recommend you start looking for a lawyer. Ivy didn't blink as Rourke was led away. One battle down. But the war against this system was just beginning. Ivy Lawson sat in her office, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the stacks of case files in front of her. The Rourke case was just the beginning. If she had learned anything in her years in law enforcement, it was that one bad officer rarely operated alone. Corruption thrived in silence, in the unspoken agreements between those who looked the other way. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan Morales, the journalist who had covered the incident. You were right, there's more. Call me. Ivy exhaled sharply, grabbed her coat, and headed out. If the press was picking up the scent, it meant the rot in the department ran deeper than she had even suspected. She met Ryan at a small coffee shop on the east side of the city, where he slid a flash drive across the table. This isn't just about Rourke, he said, voice low. There's a pattern, and it goes way up the chain. Ivy plugged the drive into her laptop, watching as the files loaded. Internal reports, complaints, body cam footage that never made it to official records. The deeper she dug, the more her stomach twisted. Dozens of cases. She clenched her jaw. Who's protecting them? Ryan leaned forward. Your police chief? Ivy's pulse spiked. If that was true, it meant the man running the department, the one who was supposed to enforce integrity, had been pulling the strings to cover up misconduct. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Ivy walked into the precinct, her badge clipped onto her belt, a folder tucked under her arm. The chief's office door was open. He looked up, smiling. Agent Lawson, to what do I owe the pleasure? Ivy set the folder on his desk and slid it toward him. Explain this. His face didn't change, but she saw it, the flicker of tension in his eyes, the slight tensing of his jaw. He knew. You don't know what you're getting into, he said, voice steady but laced with warning. Ivy folded her arms. Actually, I do, and soon so will the DA. The room went silent. A war was coming. But Ivy had already decided she wasn't backing down. Ivy Lawson had seen many men in power fall, but what always surprised her was how long they managed to stay standing before the world finally saw them for what they were. Chief Donovan was no different. His office had been built on secrets, backdoor deals, and favors owed, but now his empire was crumbling. Sitting in the DA's office, Ivy laid out the evidence. This isn't just a few bad cops, she said. This is an entire network of corruption, and at the center of it, Donovan. The district attorney, Samuel Hughes, flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. Ivy knew he was weighing his options. Going after a sitting police chief wasn't a simple task, but the evidence, the altered reports, the suppressed complaints, the body cam footage that had magically disappeared, was undeniable. Finally, Hughes set the folder down and met her gaze. Are you ready for this? Ivy exhaled slowly. I've been ready. That night, she watched from her car as Ryan Morales' exclusive story broke on the evening news. The footage, the hidden reports, the audio recordings, it was all there. And the public? They weren't going to look away this time. The phone rang. Chief Donovan. She answered, keeping her voice level. Good evening, Chief. There was a pause, then his voice thick with barely contained anger. You have no idea what you've done. Ivy smirked, watching as a group of officers walked into the station, carrying sealed warrants. Oh, I think I do. The line went dead. A few minutes later, as she stepped out of her car, she heard the first of many sirens wailing in the distance. This wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. The weight of the moment settled over Ivy Lawson as she stepped into the bustling courthouse. The world had finally caught up with Chief Donovan. The once untouchable man now sat at the defendant's table, his crisp uniform replaced by a stiff suit, his face devoid of the arrogance that once defined him. This was no longer his city. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, community activists, off-duty officers, and ordinary citizens who had waited for this day. For years, Donovan had ruled with impunity, twisting the law to suit his needs, silencing those who dared to challenge him. But today, he was the one answering to the law. Ivy took her place at the prosecutor's table, her posture unwavering. She had built this case piece by piece, chasing leads that had led her into dark alleys and deeper secrets than she had ever imagined. Donovan hadn't just covered up misconduct. He had orchestrated a criminal enterprise within the department, one that thrived on bribery, extortion, and violence. The judge entered, the room settled, the trial began. As the prosecution laid out the charges, Ivy watched Donovan closely. He didn't flinch when the evidence was presented. The missing body cam footage, the altered reports, the testimonies from officers who had finally come forward. But when the prosecution played the final piece of evidence, a recording of Donovan ordering the cover-up of a fatal police shooting, his jaw tightened. The gallery murmured. The weight of his actions was now undeniable. When the judge called for a recess, Donovan turned toward Ivy, his voice low and sharp. You think you've won? Ivy met his gaze without hesitation. I don't think, Chief. I know. She walked away, leaving him to sit with the truth that the city he had once controlled was no longer his to manipulate. The precinct was silent, suffocated by an unspoken tension that thickened the air. Detective Jordan Hayes stood in the center of it all, gripping his resignation letter. The paper felt heavier than it should have, but maybe that was fitting. It carried the weight of everything he had fought for and everything he had lost. He had spent 15 years wearing the badge, believing in its power to serve and protect. But over time, he had seen the cracks, cases buried, victims ignored, officers rewarded not for justice, but for silence. And now, standing here, he could no longer pretend that the system wasn't rotting from the inside out. Across from him, Captain Reynolds leaned against his desk, arms crossed. You don't have to do this, Jordan. His voice carried an edge of something unspoken, perhaps regret. Jordan exhaled slowly. You saw the footage. The recording that exposed the corruption within their own ranks, that proved everything Jordan had suspected. Officers who had sworn to protect the community had instead preyed upon it. The proof was undeniable. Reynolds looked away, jaw tight. You think walking away changes anything? Jordan set the letter down. I think staying makes me complicit. Silence stretched between them. The truth was, Jordan had never feared criminals the way he feared the system that shielded them in uniform. He had spent years justifying the cover-ups, telling himself change was slow, that real reform took time. But that was a lie. Change wasn't slow, it was fought for, demanded. And it was clear now, this fight could not be won from the inside. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. You're a damn good cop. Jordan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then maybe I'll do more good without the badge. He turned, walking toward the door. Each step felt lighter, as if he was finally shedding a weight that had been crushing him for years. Behind him, Reynolds called out, If you go public with this, you'll be making enemies. Jordan paused at the door. I already have. And with that, he stepped out, no longer a detective, but something far more dangerous, a man who refused to stay silent. The courtroom was packed, the tension suffocating. All eyes were on the witness stand, where former Officer Miles Carter sat, hands clasped together, his knuckles white. He had spent years on the force, upholding the blue wall of silence, looking the other way when the job required it. But today, there was no looking away. Today, he was about to break a code stronger than the law itself, the code of silence. The prosecutor stepped forward, voice measured but firm. "Officer Carter, can you confirm that you were present on the night of September 14th when Officers Delgado and Briggs detained Mr. Isaiah Bennett?" Miles swallowed hard. He had been trained for years to deflect, to protect his own, to twist the truth until it became unrecognizable. But Isaiah Bennett wasn't some faceless suspect. He was a man, a father, a husband, who had begged for his life before it was stolen in the back of a police transport van. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I was there." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. On the defense bench, Delgado and Briggs sat stone-faced, their lawyers stiffening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Carter was supposed to deny, deflect anything but tell the truth. The prosecutor didn't let up. "And did you witness excessive force being used against Mr. Bennett?" Miles's hands trembled. He had told himself over and over that he had no choice that night, that speaking up then would have ended his career. But staying silent had cost a man his life, and now the weight of that silence was unbearable. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger now. "They beat him. They ignored his pleas for help, and when he lost consciousness, they left him there." Gasps filled the room. The judge's gavel slammed down. But Miles didn't flinch. He had already crossed the line. There was no going back. From the defense table, Delgado's glare burned into him, but it didn't matter anymore. For the first time in his career, Miles Carter had done the right thing. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. As he stepped down, Miles felt the weight of years of complicity lift from his shoulders. The truth was dangerous, but silence had been worse. And today, he had chosen justice. The city's police chief, Gordon Langley, sat behind his desk, his face a mask of quiet control. He had been in law enforcement for over 3 decades, but this was the first time he felt the walls closing in. The morning's headlines screamed at him from across the room. "Exposing the system, a department built on corruption." The article detailed the long-ignored complaints, the falsified reports, and most damning of all, the cover-ups that had kept men like Officer Delgado and Briggs on the streets. Langley had always known how to handle a crisis. A well-timed press conference, a suspension here, a reassignment there, it was usually enough to quiet the public. But not this time. Not after one of his own had flipped. Miles Carter's testimony had set a wildfire that couldn't be contained. The mayor's voice crackled through the phone speaker, sharp and unforgiving. "We can't make this go away, Gordon." Langley closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to balance the scales, to keep the department running smoothly while shielding it from scrutiny. But now, the balance was gone. The people wanted justice, and the politicians wanted a sacrifice. He leaned forward, rubbing his temple. There was only one way out of this. He reached for the folder sitting on his desk, flipping it open to the names of officers with long histories of misconduct. Men he had protected. Men he now had to throw to the wolves. His finger hovered over Delgado's name. He was loyal, but loyalty didn't matter anymore. Langley had a department to save, and sacrifices had to be made. He picked up the phone. "I want terminations processed immediately. Delgado, Briggs, and 3 others. Make it clean." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before his assistant responded. "Understood." Langley hung up, staring out the window at the city he had sworn to serve. He had spent years mastering the art of control. But today, the real power belonged to the truth, and the truth was no longer his to manipulate. The press conference was scheduled for noon. By 11:30, the City Hall atrium was packed. Reporters, community activists, and uniformed officers standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for what would be a defining moment in the department's history. The air was thick with anticipation. the kind that came before either redemption or ruin. Police Chief Gordon Langley adjusted his tie, staring at his reflection in the mirror of his private office. His career had been built on strategy, on knowing how to navigate political minefields without stepping on the wrong toes. But today, there was no strategy left, only survival. The department's corruption had been laid bare. There was no containing the fallout now. The mayor's voice rang in his ears from their earlier meeting. "You're taking the podium, Gordon, and you're taking responsibility." He had no choice. Not after the federal investigation had been announced. Not after the footage of officers brutalizing civilians had surfaced. Not after Miles Carter's testimony had exposed the rot within his ranks. Langley stepped onto the stage, cameras flashing in his face. He cleared his throat, gripping the podium with steady hands. The statement in front of him was filled with carefully crafted language, admitting lapses in oversight rather than outright crimes, committing to rebuilding public trust without acknowledging how deeply it had been shattered. He glanced up, meeting the eyes of the crowd. They weren't looking for polished words. They were looking for accountability. The weight of it all settled on his chest. For the first time in his career, Langley wasn't in control. He took a slow breath, then, in a voice that carried across the atrium, he said the one thing he had never imagined himself saying. "I am resigning, effective immediately." A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scrambled, shoving microphones forward. Langley ignored them. He unpinned his badge, setting it gently on the podium before stepping away. As he walked off the stage, the world behind him erupting into chaos, he realized something. The system had protected him for decades, but even the most fortified walls crumble when the foundation is rotten. And today, the walls had finally fallen.